At 40, retirement sounded like rest. At 72, it feels more like a quiet reckoning. No one warned me how identity, time, friendships, and fear would shift once the working years ended, and how much inner preparation matters more than money. For most of my life, I woke up knowing exactly where I belonged. There was a place that expected me, a role that needed filling, a name attached to a desk, a schedule that quietly confirmed I mattered. I didn't think of it as applause at the time. It was subtler than that. It was the nod from a colleague, the problem only I knew how to solve, the unspoken understanding that my absence would be noticed. When retirement arrived, I thought I was prepared. I had planned the finances. I had imagined the rest. What I had not prepared for was the silence. The first weeks felt like relief. No alarms. No deadlines. No one asking for anything before coffee. But slowly, something shifted. The phone rang less. Emails stopped altogether. Introductions changed. I was no longer the one who does anything in particular. I was simply someone who used to. That realization arrived quietly, often in the middle of an ordinary day, and it carried more weight than I expected. Work had given shape to my identity for decades, not because I loved every moment of it, but because it offered structure and recognition. It told me where I fit in the world. Without it, I felt oddly unfinished, as if a long sentence had ended without punctuation. I didn't miss the stress. I missed the feeling of being counted. There was no dramatic sadness, no collapse, just a low, steady sense of displacement. I would find myself wondering if I still had a place that was uniquely mine. The question wasn't about usefulness in a practical sense. It was about meaning, about whether the world still had a clear reason to notice my presence. What surprised me most was how long that feeling lingered. I assumed identity would simply adjust on its own, the way the body adjusts to a new pair of shoes. Instead, it asked for attention. It asked for patience. It asked me to sit with the discomfort of not knowing who I was without my title attached. Over time, I learned that this was not something to rush past. There was value in the pause. The silence, uncomfortable as it was, created space to hear parts of myself that had been drowned out by routine. I began to notice that identity, built only on function, is fragile. When the function ends, the person feels at risk of ending too. This chapter of retirement is not about regret. I don't wish I had worked less or chosen differently. It is about acknowledging that stepping away from work is not just a logistical change, it is an emotional crossing. And like any crossing, it requires time to stand on the other side and let the ground feel solid again. As the applause faded, something else began to surface. A quieter voice, less impressed by productivity, more interested in presence. I didn't recognize it right away, but it would become important in the chapters that followed. Once the structure of work fell away, time opened up in ways I had once longed for. Entire mornings with nowhere to be. Afternoons that stretched without obligation. On paper, it looked like freedom. In practice, it felt more complicated. Time, I learned, does not automatically become gentle when it becomes abundant. At first, I filled it easily. Small projects, delayed errands, long breakfasts. But novelty wears thin. Soon, I noticed how the days could blur together. Without anchors, hours lost their shape. It became harder to remember what I had done yesterday, or what today was meant to hold. Too much open space, I discovered, can feel as confining as too little. There were moments when rest turned into restlessness. I would feel tired without having done anything, as if my energy had nowhere meaningful to go. The clock ticked loudly in the background of my thoughts. I wasn't bored exactly. I was unmoored. Time had stopped asking anything of me, and I didn't yet know how to ask anything of it. This was not a failure of imagination. It was a transition of rhythm. For decades, my days had been externally shaped. Now, the responsibility for shape belonged to me alone. That sounds empowering, but it can also feel heavy. When no one needs you at a certain hour, every hour must be justified internally. I noticed that my mood followed my relationship with time. On days when I drifted, I felt smaller. On days when I found even a simple reason to mark the hours, I felt steadier. It wasn't about being busy, it was about being engaged. Time wanted companionship, not conquest. Gradually, I began to understand that peace in retirement does not come from endless leisure. It comes from rhythm that feels chosen rather than imposed. From mornings that begin with intention, even if that intention is modest. From evenings that close with a sense that the day had a beginning, a middle, and an end. There was grief in realizing that time would never again be filled the way it once was, but there was also a possibility. I could listen more carefully, I could move more slowly, I could allow days to breathe without letting them dissolve. This required attention, not effort, awareness, not pressure. As I learned to hold time rather than let it spill, something softened. The weight lifted slightly. The days began to feel less like empty containers and more like open landscapes. And in that space I began to notice who was walking beside me and who was quietly falling away. Work had not only structured my time, it had structured my relationships. Many of the people I spoke to most often were tied to shared responsibilities. We laughed in hallways, supported each other through stress, and assumed, without saying it, that these connections would last. Retirement tested that assumption. The change was gradual. Lunch invitations stopped. Conversations shortened. We no longer had a common language of deadlines and daily frustrations. Without the shared context, it became harder to know where to meet. No one meant to disappear. Life simply reorganized itself around different centers. At the same time, family life did not expand to fill the gap. Children had their own rhythms. Grandchildren grew busy. Everyone loved me. But love does not always translate into presence. I found myself alone more often than I had anticipated, and more often than I knew how to explain. Loneliness did not arrive dramatically. It arrived in small, ordinary moments, a thought I had no one to share, a memory that stayed in my head, an afternoon that passed without conversation. These moments accumulated quietly, and I had to acknowledge them honestly. There was grief in letting go of friendships that belonged to an earlier chapter of life. Grief, too, in accepting that some bonds are seasonal. They are real and meaningful, but not permanent. This understanding took time. It asked me to release expectations without becoming bitter. Building new connections later in life requires a different kind of courage, not the boldness of youth, but the vulnerability of beginning again. There is no guarantee of history, no shared past to lean on, just the willingness to show up as you are now, without the roles that once introduced you. I learned that connection in this stage of life often grows more slowly. It deepens through consistency, not intensity, through shared presence rather than shared achievement. This was humbling and also grounding. It reminded me that friendship is not something you retire from. It simply asks to be reimagined. As my social world shifted, another realization followed. Even when surrounded by people, one can still feel unseen. That feeling led me to confront a quieter fear, one I had not expected to face so clearly. There is a moment, often unspoken, when you sense that the world is no longer looking in your direction. Conversations move faster around you. Decisions are made without your input. You are respected, perhaps, but not required. This is the fear of becoming invisible, and it can settle deeply if left unexamined. For much of my life, visibility was tied to contribution. I was seen because I produced, decided, led, or solved. Retirement loosened that connection. I noticed how often worth is measured by output and how easily aging can be mistaken for absence. This invisibility is not always imposed from the outside. Sometimes it begins internally. We step back before being asked to. We speak less. We assume our time has passed. Dignity, in this sense, becomes fragile, not because it is taken, but because it is surrendered. Facing this fear required honesty. I had to ask whether I still believed my presence mattered without proof, whether I could value myself without an audience. These questions were uncomfortable, but they were also clarifying. They pointed me toward a different understanding of relevance. Relevance does not have to mean influence. It can mean steadiness. It can mean listening without needing to respond. It can mean carrying memory, perspective, and restraint in a world that often moves too quickly to notice their worth. These are quieter contributions, but they are not smaller. I began to see that visibility is not the same as value. One can be deeply valuable without being widely seen. This realization did not erase the fear, but it softened it. It allowed me to hold dignity as something internal, not granted by recognition. As this understanding settled, something else became possible. I stopped waiting for retirement to deliver peace. I began to see that peace had its own requirements, ones I had not fully considered before. At 40, I believed retirement was a destination, a place you arrive at and finally exhale. At 72, I understand that it is not a destination, but a landscape, and like any landscape, it must be navigated with awareness. Peace did not appear simply because work ended. In some ways, the noise quieted. In others, it grew louder. Old questions resurfaced. Unresolved emotions had more room to speak. Without distraction, the inner life becomes harder to ignore. I learned that peace is not the absence of responsibility. It is the presence of acceptance. Acceptance of limits. Acceptance of change. Acceptance of who you are when striving is no longer the center of your days. This acceptance cannot be rushed. It unfolds gradually through reflection rather than achievement. Meaning, I discovered, shifts shape in later life. It becomes less about building and more about inhabiting, less about accumulation and more about presence. Purpose does not vanish with retirement. It simply asks to be redefined. There were moments of disappointment, moments when I realized I had expected too much from this phase of life. But there were also moments of quiet clarity, moments when sitting still felt complete, when being, rather than doing, felt enough. Peace, in the end, is not something retirement gives you. It is something you cultivate within it, through honesty, through patience, through allowing yourself to be a person, not a role. When I stopped waiting for peace to arrive, it began, slowly, to find me. This is what I wish I had known at 40. Not as a warning, but as a truth. Retirement does not finish the story. It changes the voice in which the story is told. And if listened to carefully, that voice can still speak with depth, dignity, and quiet wisdom.